83 years of mornings, and still the first thought is of her, Margaret. The name sits heavy in my chest like a stone I swallowed 6 decades ago and never quite managed to digest. From my kitchen window, I watch the sunrise paint the world in shades of gold, the same colors that once danced in her auburn hair. The house around me breathes with memories. Photographs line the mantelpiece, my late wife Sarah, our children, grandchildren, yet none carry the haunting weight of that single picture tucked away in my desk drawer. The one I haven't looked at in 5 years but could describe in perfect detail. Margaret, at 22, laughing at something I said, her eyes bright with a future we'd never share. Time moves differently when you carry unfinished business. The grandfather clock in the hallway marks each second with deliberate precision, a metronome counting down to nothing in particular. Tick, tock, tick, tock. 60 years of ticking, 60 years of wondering why she left without explanation, 60 years of nurturing a resentment I've worn like a familiar coat. Sarah used to say I was fighting ghosts. She'd catch me staring into the distance during dinner, lost in thoughts I couldn't voice. "You're here but not here, William," she'd whisper, her voice carrying the patient sadness of a woman who knew she was sharing her husband with a memory. She was right, of course. Sarah was always right. But something shifted yesterday when I found her obituary in the morning paper. Margaret Sullivan, age 81, passed peacefully surrounded by family. The words blurred as I read them, and for the first time in decades, I wondered if I'd been the villain in my own story. The thought terrified me more than death itself, that I might have spent a lifetime hating someone who deserved my forgiveness. Margaret's obituary mentioned she'd been a teacher for 40 years, touching countless young lives with her patience and kindness. The woman I'd painted as selfish and cruel in my memory had dedicated her life to nurturing others. The contradiction sat uneasily in my stomach as I folded the newspaper with trembling hands. I met Margaret in 1962 at a church social. I was 23, fresh out of college, and convinced I could conquer the world. She was everything I thought I wanted, beautiful, intelligent, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. We courted for 8 months, and I was certain she was the woman I'd marry. I even bought a ring, a modest diamond that represented every penny I'd saved. Then she vanished. One Tuesday evening, she was planning our future over dinner at Murphy's Diner, discussing which hymns she'd want at our wedding. By Friday, her landlady told me she'd packed her bags and left town with no forwarding address. No explanation, no goodbye, no acknowledgement of the promises we'd whispered to each other under summer stars. The betrayal carved itself into my soul. I spent months writing letters I never sent, visiting places we'd been together, hoping to catch a glimpse of her familiar silhouette. Friends tried to comfort me, suggesting she'd had her reasons, but their words felt like salt in an open wound. How could someone claim to love you and disappear like morning mist? Eventually, I convinced myself I hated her. Hatred felt cleaner than heartbreak, more manageable than the vulnerability of still caring. When I met Sarah 2 years later, I built our relationship on the foundation of that carefully constructed hatred. Sarah deserved better than the man I'd become, cautious with my heart, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marriage to Sarah was good, comfortable in the way a well-broken shoe fits your foot. She was nothing like Margaret, practical where Margaret was dreamy, steady where Margaret was spontaneous. I told myself this was what I wanted, what I needed. Sarah wouldn't break my heart because I only gave her the pieces that weren't already broken. We built a life together, brick by careful brick. A modest house on Elm Street, 3 children who grew up knowing their father but never quite understanding his distant moods. Sunday dinners that followed the same pattern for 37 years. Sarah never complained about the emotional walls I'd built, but I caught her studying my face sometimes, searching for the man I might have been. She was right, of course. Sarah was always right. I thought Margaret had destroyed. Yet even in those tender moments, her absence echoed. When Susan laughed a certain way, when David showed his stubborn streak, when Robert asked why Daddy sometimes looked so sad, Margaret's ghost stirred in the shadows. Sarah got sick in our 61st year of marriage. Cancer, swift and merciless. As I held her hand in those final weeks, she whispered words that haunted me. "I hope you find peace with her memory, William. You've carried that pain long enough." Even dying, she was thinking of my healing rather than her own suffering. After Sarah's funeral, the house felt different. Without her gentle presence buffering my thoughts, Margaret's memory grew louder. I'd catch myself wondering what became of her, whether she'd found happiness, whether she ever thought of the young man she'd left behind in our small Indiana town. The wondering felt like betrayal of Sarah's memory, yet I couldn't stop. Grief has a way of sharpening memories you thought you dulled. After Sarah's passing, every mundane moment seemed designed to resurrect Margaret's presence. The scent of lilacs from Mrs. Henderson's garden next door transported me instantly to that spring evening when Margaret and I walked through Riverside Park, her hand warm in mine as we planned impossible futures. Music became my enemy. The local radio station's afternoon classics hour felt like emotional ambush. Every song from the early 60s a direct line to feelings I'd buried. Moon River played during my grocery shopping last month, and I found myself gripping the shopping cart handle, transported back to that humid August night when Margaret hummed it while we danced on her front porch. Even the mundane act of cooking triggered memories. Margaret had taught me to make her grandmother's cornbread recipe during one lazy Sunday afternoon. The secret, she'd whispered, flour dusting her cheek, is adding just a touch of honey. 40 years of marriage to Sarah, and I never once made cornbread, as if avoiding it could keep Margaret's ghost at bay. Photographs became dangerous territory. Not just the hidden picture in my desk drawer, but every old snapshot that might accidentally include a stranger with auburn hair or a familiar tilt of the head. I'd developed the habit of scanning backgrounds obsessively, searching for a woman who'd be in her 80s now, changed beyond recognition by time's patient sculpting. The worst triggers were the young couples I'd see around town, holding hands outside the movie theater, sharing ice cream at Miller's drugstore, looking at each other with that mixture of passion and certainty that belongs only to first love. Their joy reminded me of what Margaret and I had been, and more painfully, what we'd never had the chance to become. Loneliness has a way of forcing conversations you've avoided for decades. 6 months after Sarah's funeral, I found myself talking to her photograph on the kitchen counter, confessing secrets I'd never voiced aloud. "I think I loved her more than I loved you," I whispered, then immediately felt the crushing weight of that admission. But something surprising followed that moment of brutal honesty: relief. For the first time in 60 years, I'd acknowledged the truth that had shaped every relationship since Margaret's departure. I hadn't just lost a girlfriend, I'd lost the version of myself that loved without reservation, trusted without fear, dreamed without boundaries. My grandson Tommy visited last spring, fresh from his own romantic heartbreak. As he sobbed over his girlfriend's betrayal, I saw my younger self reflected in his pain. The words I offered him surprised me. "Son, sometimes people leave because staying would hurt both of you more. Sometimes love means letting go, even when nobody understands." Where had that wisdom come from? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Margaret had been young, only 21, from a strict Catholic family with specific expectations about marriage and respectability. I'd been pushing for an engagement, talking about starting a family immediately, painting pictures of a future that might have terrified a girl who'd barely begun to discover herself. Maybe her leaving wasn't about cruelty or selfishness. Maybe it was about a young woman recognizing she wasn't ready for the forever I was demanding. Maybe she'd tried to find a way to explain, but couldn't find words that wouldn't destroy me anymore. The possibility that I'd spent 60 years hating someone who'd actually been trying to save us both felt like a revelation and a devastation rolled into one. Spring cleaning had always been Sarah's domain, but living alone forced me to confront the accumulated decades in our attic. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight as I sorted through boxes of Christmas decorations, children's school papers, and Sarah's carefully preserved mementos. Then I found it, a shoebox I'd forgotten existed, tucked behind my old army uniforms. Inside, like artifacts from an archaeological dig of my younger self, lay the evidence of my love for Margaret. Movie ticket stubs from Lawrence of Arabia, pressed flowers from our picnic at Lake Monroe, a cocktail napkin where she'd written, "I love you, William," in her careful script. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was the engagement ring I'd never had the chance to offer. But the most shocking discovery was a letter in my own handwriting, sealed but never sent. The envelope bore Margaret's name and what I remembered as her last address. My 23-year-old self had written it 6 months after her departure, the ink slightly smeared where tears had fallen. With trembling hands, I opened it and read words I'd forgotten I'd written. "My dearest Margaret, I don't understand why you left, but I need you to know I forgive you. If I did something wrong, if I pushed too hard, if I scared you somehow, I'm sorry. I just want to know you're safe and happy. I'll always love you, no matter what. Your William." The man who'd written those words seemed like a stranger to the bitter person I'd become. The letter had been written in love, not anger. Somehow, in the decades since, I'd rewritten our story, transforming myself from a heartbroken but forgiving young man into a victim of unforgivable cruelty. The realization was like looking in a mirror and seeing a face I didn't recognize, or perhaps seeing clearly for the first time in 60 years. That night, I sat in Sarah's old rocking chair, the unmailed letter in my lap, and faced the devastating math of time lost. 60 years of carrying poison that had infected every relationship, every moment of joy, every opportunity for pure happiness. 60 years of punishing Margaret in my heart for a crime she might never have committed. Sarah had borne the brunt of my emotional damage. Every time she'd tried to love me completely, she'd encountered the wall I built around my heart. Every time she'd suggested we travel to new places, try new experiences, open ourselves to adventure, I'd resisted, afraid that joy would somehow betray my commitment to grievance. I'd made her live in the shadow of a ghost. My children had suffered too, though they'd never known why their father seemed perpetually sad, why affection came so grudgingly, why he flinched when they spoke of their own romantic dreams. I'd taught them, without meaning to, that love was dangerous, that trust was foolish, that protecting yourself was more important than opening your heart. The ripple effects were staggering. How many moments of beauty had I missed because I was too busy nursing old wounds? How many sunsets had I watched without really seeing? How many of Sarah's smiles had I met with distraction rather than gratitude? How many times had my grandchildren reached for my attention while I was lost in resentment that had nothing to do with them? Most painful was the realization that Margaret herself might have spent 60 years wondering about me. While I was constructing elaborate narratives of her selfishness, she might have been living with her own regrets, her own what-ifs, her own carefully guarded memories of a young man she'd loved but couldn't stay with. Margaret's obituary had mentioned surviving children and grandchildren, a life fully lived in a town 3 hours north of here. For the first time in 6 decades, I had a concrete trail to follow, a way to learn who she'd really become. The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I spent hours staring at my phone, composing and deleting messages to her daughter, whose contact information I'd found through online searching that felt both invasive and necessary. What do you say to the child of someone who'd shaped your entire life without their knowledge? How do you explain 60 years of wondering to someone who might not even know your name? Finally, I called. Margaret's daughter Jennifer had her mother's voice, warm and musical, with the same slight lisp I'd found so endearing decades ago. When I explained who I was, silence stretched between us like a held breath. Then, softly, "Oh my goodness, you're William. Mom mentioned you sometimes, especially near the end." Jennifer's words tumbled out in a rush, painting a picture of Margaret that both shattered and rebuilt my understanding. She'd become a teacher because she loved nurturing young minds. She'd never married, though she'd had several long relationships. She'd traveled, volunteered at homeless shelters, been beloved by her community. And yes, she'd thought of me, wondered what became of the earnest young man who'd loved her so completely. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. "She left town because she was pregnant," Jennifer said quietly. "With me. She was terrified to tell you, terrified to trap you in a marriage you might resent later. She thought she was protecting both of you by disappearing." The world shifted on its axis as I realized the woman I'd spent 60 years resenting had sacrificed her own happiness to preserve mine. Jennifer agreed to meet me at a small cafe halfway between our towns. I arrived 30 minutes early, my hands shaking as I ordered coffee I couldn't taste. When she walked in, I nearly wept. She had Margaret's eyes, my own stubborn jawline, and a smile that belonged to both of us, but was uniquely hers. "I've wondered about you my entire life," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Mom would get this distant look sometimes, especially on stormy nights, and I'd know she was thinking about someone from her past. She told me about you when I turned 30, said I had the right to know my father's name." The conversation that followed was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle I'd been missing pieces to for 60 years. Margaret had worked 2 jobs to support them both, had earned her teaching degree through night school, had created a beautiful life from impossible circumstances. She'd never asked for help because she'd convinced herself I was better off not knowing. Jennifer showed me photographs on her phone. Margaret at various stages of life, always with that familiar spark in her eyes, but tempered now with a wisdom born of struggle. There were pictures of Jennifer's childhood, her own children, family gatherings I should have been part of but had never known existed. An entire family tree with my DNA running through it, thriving without my knowledge or participation. "She used to say she hoped you found someone who made you happy," Jennifer continued. "She felt guilty for leaving the way she did, but she was terrified you'd marry her out of obligation rather than love. She thought she was 21 and being noble, though she admitted later it might have been the worst decision she ever made." The weight of 60 years of misunderstanding settled over me like a blanket made of lead. This wasn't the story I'd told myself, where I was the wounded victim and Margaret was the heartless villain. This was a story of 2 young people who'd loved each other enough to make devastating sacrifices, neither understanding what the other was truly choosing. Jennifer had brought photographs of her own children, my grandchildren, whose existence rewrote everything I thought I knew about my legacy. Michael, 28, had my hands and Margaret's artistic sensibility. Sarah, named impossibly after my late wife, though Jennifer couldn't have known, was 25, with my engineering mind and Margaret's fierce independence. They were strangers who carried my DNA, my traits, my stubborn streak. They'd grown up hearing stories about the grandfather they'd never meet, the man their grandmother had loved and lost. Jennifer had painted me in generous colors for their sake, describing the young William as kind, ambitious, someone who would have been a wonderful father if circumstances had been different. "Michael builds furniture," Jennifer explained, showing me pictures of intricate wooden pieces. "He's never had a lesson, just seems to understand how wood wants to be shaped." "Sarah's a civil engineer, designing bridges. She says she inherited a love of connecting things from someone, though we never knew who." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career as a carpenter, had worked on bridge construction in my younger years. The missed opportunities stretched out like an endless highway. First steps I hadn't witnessed, school plays I hadn't attended, birthdays and graduations, and heartbreaks where my presence might have mattered. I could have taught Michael woodworking, could have discussed engineering principles with Sarah, could have been the grandfather who taught them to fish and told them stories about their remarkable mother. But perhaps most painful was learning that Margaret had kept a scrapbook about my life. Jennifer produced it from her purse, a worn photo album where Margaret had collected newspaper clippings about my business, my community involvement, my marriage to Sarah, my children's achievements. She'd been quietly proud of me from a distance, following my life like a devoted ghost I'd never known was there. Jennifer offered to take me to Margaret's grave, and I found myself accepting before my rational mind could intervene. The cemetery was peaceful, dotted with oak trees that cast dancing shadows across the headstones. Margaret's marker was simple: Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan, beloved mother and teacher, 1940-2021. She loved deeply and gave freely. Standing there, I felt the crushing weight of 6 decades worth of words I'd never spoken. Jennifer squeezed my arm and walked away, giving me privacy for a conversation I should have had 60 years ago. The afternoon sun was warm on my shoulders as I knelt beside the headstone, my arthritic knees protesting against the stone-cold ground. "Hello, Margaret," I whispered, feeling foolish and necessary at the same time. "I found out about Jennifer, about why you left. I understand now, and I'm so sorry. I spent all these years angry at you. You were trying to protect me, weren't you? You were being noble, and I was too young and hurt to see it." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and for a moment I could swear I smelled lilacs, Margaret's favorite perfume. "I married a wonderful woman named Sarah. She would have liked you, I think. She was patient with my broken heart, even though I never told her it belonged to you. I should have told her about you, about us, about the love that shaped everything that came after." Tears I'd held back for 60 years finally came, hot and cleansing. "I wasted so much time hating you, Margaret. So much time that could have been spent celebrating what we had instead of mourning what we lost. Jennifer is beautiful, brilliant, everything you would have wanted for our daughter. You did a magnificent job raising her alone. You were braver than I ever gave you credit for." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and paper, determined to write the letter I should have written 60 years ago. Not the angry, demanding missives I'd composed in my head over the decades, but the words my heart would have chosen if my pride hadn't gotten in the way. "My dearest Margaret," I began, the words flowing easier than they had in decades. "I know you're beyond the reach of letters now, but I need to say these things, if only to the wind and the stars that remember us as we were, young, foolish, and so deeply in love we didn't know how to handle the weight of it." The letter became a confession, an apology, a celebration of the woman I'd spent 60 years misunderstanding. I wrote about the life we'd built apart, how her daughter had grown into someone magnificent, how her decision to leave, though it had broken both our hearts, might have been the right one after all. We'd been children playing at being adults, unprepared for the responsibilities we'd been so eager to embrace. I wrote about Sarah, how I loved her, but never quite the way I'd loved Margaret, and how that had been unfair to everyone involved. I wrote about my regrets, not just the anger I'd carried, but the opportunities I'd missed because I'd been too busy nursing old wounds to recognize new possibilities for joy, for growth, for connection. The letter grew to 7 pages, 60 years worth of thoughts distilled into their purest essence. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the grandfather clock chimed midnight, until I'd said everything I needed to say to the woman who'd haunted my dreams and shaped my reality without ever knowing the power she held over my heart. When I finished, I felt lighter than I had in decades, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The letter would never be nailed, never be read by its intended recipient. Imperfect, but it had served its purpose anyway. It had freed me from the prison of my own making. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I drove back to Margaret's cemetery, the letter folded carefully in my jacket pocket. The groundskeeper nodded as I passed. I was becoming a familiar sight, the old man who talked to the headstone under the oak tree. "I brought you something," I said, settling into the folding chair Jennifer had suggested I keep in my car for these visits. I unfolded the letter and began to read it aloud, my voice carrying across the peaceful cemetery. With each word, each paragraph, each page, I felt the anger and resentment of 60 years dissolving like morning mist. When I finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it on Margaret's grave, weighing it down with a small stone. A gentle breeze lifted the corners, and for a moment I was tempted to grab it back, to keep these private words private forever. Instead, I watched as the wind claimed it, carrying it up and away into the infinite blue sky. "I forgive you, Margaret," I said aloud, the words carrying more power than any I'd ever spoken. "I forgive you for leaving, for not telling me about Jennifer, for making us both carry this secret for 60 years. But most of all, I forgive myself for wasting so much time on anger instead of gratitude. We had something beautiful, didn't we? Even if it was brief, even if it ended badly, it was real and pure and worth celebrating." As I drove home, something fundamental had shifted in my chest. The tight knot of resentment that had lived there for 6 decades was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Margaret was free of my anger at last, but more importantly, I was free of it too. The forgiveness had been as much for me as for her, maybe more. That evening, I called Jennifer and asked if she'd like to bring her children for dinner on Sunday. It was time to stop being a stranger to my own family, time to build the relationships I should have been nurturing all along. At 83, I was finally ready to live in the present instead of the past, to love without reservation, to trust that some stories have beautiful endings, even when they don't unfold the way we expect them to. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true, emotional tales about love, time, and second chances. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel, another unforgettable journey about the loves we never truly lose.